in 11 years. The fight lasted less than 4 minutes. The larger man did not fall from a single blow. He did not collapse from exhaustion. He stopped in the middle of the exchange and simply would not continue. No one in the room fully understood what they had witnessed. Some said it was technique. Some said it was speed. A few who stood close enough to see the challenger's eyes in the final moments said it was something else entirely, something that had no name in the sport. What follows is drawn from the accounts of those who were present, from what they saw, from what they remembered, and from what they could not bring themselves to forget. Hong Kong in the early 1970s was a city living in two directions at once. On one side, the modern world was pressing in, commerce, cinema, the slow westernization of its skyline. On the other, something older held its ground, something that had existed long before the cameras arrived and would continue long after they left. The challenge circuit. It had no official name, no governing body, no sanctioned rule set printed on paper and filed with any authority. What it had was older than any of that. It had witnesses, and in the world where it operated, witnesses were the only record that mattered. The way it worked was simple and had been simple for generations. A fighter of standing, someone with a known name, a school, a lineage, could be publicly challenged by any man willing to stake his own reputation against it. The challenge would be issued openly. Declined challenges were remembered. Accepted challenges were settled in front of people whose memories were long and whose silence, once broken, traveled far. This was not sport in any modern sense of the word. There were no trophies, no prize money worth speaking of. What exchanged hands in that ring was something that could not be deposited or displayed. It was the right to be taken seriously, the right to have your name carry weight when it entered a room before you did. Lose that, and you lost something that did not come back easily. The schools understood this. The masters understood this. Even the young men who trained in back rooms and rooftop spaces, with no formal lineage and nothing but ambition and calloused hands, even they understood this. Reputation was not vanity in this world. It was infrastructure. It determined who taught, who learned, who was approached with business, with respect, with caution. And so the circuit persisted, quietly, steadily, beneath the surface of a city that was busy pretending it had moved on. By the early part of that decade, certain names had risen above the general noise of the circuit, not loudly. That was never how it worked here. Loudness was considered a form of weakness, an announcement of insecurity dressed in volume. The names that carried real weight did so without announcement. They carried it the way a stone carries density. You only understood it when you tried to lift it. These were men whose records in the challenge ring had extended across years without interruption. Men whose opponents had, in many cases, not simply lost but had walked away from the ring with something altered in them. Not broken bones, necessarily. Something less visible and considerably more permanent. Their confidence in their own understanding of combat. That was what the circuit, at its most serious level, actually traded in. Not pain. Not injury. The quiet destruction of a man's certainty about what he knew. A fighter could recover from a bruise in a week, from a fracture in months, but from the experience of doing everything correctly, everything he had been taught, everything he had practiced, everything he believed, and still finding it insufficient. That took considerably longer. Some men never fully recovered from it. They continued training, continued teaching in some cases. But something behind their eyes had shifted. The witnesses noticed, the circuit noticed, and so into this environment, this specific, pressurized, reputation-driven world, the events of this story arrived, not with noise, with a name. His name moved through the circuit the way weather moves through a valley. You did not always see it coming. But you felt the change in pressure before it arrived. Conversations shifted. Rooms reorganized themselves. Men who spoke freely found reasons to choose their words more carefully. He was known by several names depending on who was speaking and in what context. In formal settings, and there were formal settings, even in a world with no official structure, he was referred to by his school and lineage. In the circuit itself, among the fighters and the witnesses who followed its movements, he had accumulated something simpler, a descriptor that had attached itself to his reputation through years of evidence rather than self-promotion. The Iron Fist Gladiator. It was not a name he had chosen. Names chosen by others carry a different kind of weight. They are not given out of affection or marketing. They are given because the people giving them cannot find a more accurate description and eventually stop trying. He was large by the standards of the circuit. Not in a way that suggested slowness. That was the first mistake his opponents consistently made. Size, in his case, was not a substitute for technique. It was an addition to it. He had trained for the better part of 2 decades in a discipline that emphasized structural power, the use of the body's full architecture in each strike, each hold, each moment of applied pressure. What made him genuinely dangerous, however, was not physical, it was duration. He had an extraordinary capacity to maintain intensity across time. Where other fighters peaked early and managed their energy reserves through a fight, he operated on a different principle entirely. He applied consistent, unrelenting pressure, not in bursts, but as a sustained condition, like weather, again, not a single storm, but a climate. His opponents, almost without exception, described the same experience afterward. The fight would begin and they would feel capable, prepared. The early exchanges would feel manageable. And then, gradually, something would change. Not in him. He remained essentially the same throughout. The change was in them. A slow accumulation of weight, of effort, of the mounting cost of remaining in contact with something that did not diminish. By the time most men understood what was happening, the understanding arrived too late to be useful. 11 years. That was the number attached to his unbeaten record in public challenges by the time this story reaches its central point. 11 years across multiple cities, multiple disciplines, multiple opponents who had arrived with genuine credentials and genuine confidence and had left with neither fully intact. It is worth pausing on that number. 11 years in the challenge circuit is not a statistic. It is a psychological fact. It means that every man who stepped into a ring with him did so already carrying the weight of that record, already managing, before the first exchange, the knowledge of what had happened to every man before him. That weight was part of his method. He understood it clearly. He had, over the years, learned to use the reputation itself as a tool, as something that arrived in the ring before he did, and began working on his opponent from the moment the challenge was accepted. He had never, in 11 years, faced someone who did not carry that weight in, until the name arrived. The challenge was not delivered privately. That was the first thing the people closest to Lee noted when they reconstructed the sequence of events afterward. A private challenge could be declined without consequence, quietly, with explanations that satisfied no one but offended no record. The circuit had informal protocols for such things. Men found reasons, schedules, prior commitments, injuries, real or manufactured. A private challenge declined, left only a small residue. This one was issued in front of witnesses. It came through a chain of intermediaries, the way serious challenges always did, to ensure that the words arrived exactly as intended, without softening, without the natural human tendency to smooth difficult messages before delivering them. By the time it reached the people around Lee, it had traveled through enough hands to ensure that its edges remained sharp. The terms were simple: a public demonstration, a location already chosen, a date already set. The implicit understanding, carried in the structure of the challenge itself, was clear to anyone familiar with the circuit's language. Decline, and the declining becomes the story. Accept, and you step into a ring with 11 years of unbroken record standing across from you. Neither option was comfortable. That was the design. The people around Lee expected a response that matched the weight of what had arrived. Strategy, preparation, perhaps anger, controlled, directional, the kind that sharpens rather than scatters. At minimum, they expected visible processing, a man taking stock of a serious situation in a serious way. What they received was considerably quieter than that. Lee heard the terms. He asked 2 questions, both of them logistical, neither of them about the opponent. The location, the confirmed date. When he had the answers, he was silent for a moment. Not the silence of a man calculating, the silence of a man who had already finished calculating before the information arrived, and was simply confirming that the numbers matched what he had already assumed they would be. Then he accepted. Without condition. Without negotiation. Without any of the procedural discussion that typically accompanied a challenge of this visibility. The intermediary left. The room remained, and the people in it found themselves, in the days that followed, quietly unsettled by something they could not immediately name. It was not his confidence that unsettled them. They had seen his confidence before. They understood it as a feature of the man, earned, consistent, not performed. That was familiar. What unsettled them was the absence of preparation in any form they recognized. He did not alter his training in the days following the acceptance. He did not request information about the gladiator's methods, his tendencies, his recorded history in the circuit. He did not gather the people around him for discussion or tactical review. He trained as he always trained, with the same material, the same intensity, the same economy of movement that characterized everything he did. One of the people closest to him during that period said, years later, that watching Lee in the days before the fight was like watching a man prepare to make tea. Not because it was casual, because it was precise, because every movement served the outcome, and none of them were wasted on appearance. The gladiator spent those same days preparing intensely. His camp was organized. His training adjusted. His people focused. He was preparing for a fight. Lee appeared to be preparing for something else entirely. Though no one could say, with certainty, what that something was, the date arrived the way dates do, without warning, despite being known. The space was not large. That detail matters, because it shaped everything that followed. This was not an arena. Not a stadium with distance built into its architecture, distance that allows a crowd to watch events the way they watch weather, from behind glass, safely removed from the actual pressure of what is happening. This was a room. 4 walls. A ceiling low enough that sound collected against it and stayed. The witnesses were close. That was understood by everyone present. What happened in that ring would happen in front of people who could see faces, who could hear breathing, who were near enough to the exchange that they would feel, in some physical way, the proximity of what they had come to observe. That closeness was part of the circuit's tradition. Witnesses were not spectators. They were a form of record. Their presence was the documentation. Approximately 40 people were in the room that night, by most accounts. Some estimates run slightly higher. The discrepancy is typical. Memory, under pressure, tends to people spaces more densely than they actually were. What the accounts agree on is the atmosphere, the specific quality of silence that falls over a room when everyone in it understands that something is about to happen that cannot be undone. The gladiator entered first. This too was understood. The established fighter enters the space and receives it as his own before the challenger arrives. It was protocol. He moved through the room the way his reputation had trained rooms to receive him. Steadily, without theater, the 40 witnesses registered his presence the way a room registers a change in temperature. Gradually, and then all at once, he was composed, focused in a way that was visible without being demonstrative. The 11 years were in the room with him. Everyone felt them. Lee entered shortly after. The accounts of this moment vary in their details but converge on a single quality. He came in without announcement, without the particular energy that fighters often carry into public spaces, that forward, leaning readiness, that compressed intensity that signals to a room that a man has arrived in a specific mode. He came in the way someone enters a room they have been in before. Familiar. Unhurried. Several witnesses noted that this was the first moment they felt something shift, not in the room's energy, in their own certainty about what they were about to watch. The exchange began without ceremony, and almost immediately, within the first moments of contact, the witnesses understood that what they were watching did not match the shape of what they had expected to watch. The gladiator applied pressure. His method, consistent with 11 years of evidence, was to establish contact and sustain it, to make the ring feel smaller than it was, to begin the slow, cumulative work of replacing his opponent's confidence with the weight of his own consistency. It was a method that had worked, without exception, for 11 years, Lee did not receive it. That is the only accurate way to describe what the witnesses observed. He did not block it, in the conventional sense, did not absorb it, did not retreat from it. He simply was not where the pressure arrived. Not through speed alone, though the speed was noted by everyone present, and noted with the particular quality of surprise that attaches to things seen rather than described. It was something underneath the speed. A quality of positioning, of reading, of knowing, somehow, where the weight was going before the weight knew it was going there. The gladiator adjusted. He was not a man who required many exchanges to recalibrate. He had spent 11 years recalibrating against resistance, and he did so now with the efficiency of long practice. It made no measurable difference. The witnesses watched a man apply everything he knew, apply it correctly, apply it with full commitment, and find that the space where his opponent should have been was, consistently, briefly, precisely empty. Not empty through retreat, empty through understanding. One witness, a trainer with 20 years of experience in 3 separate disciplines, said afterward that watching the exchange was like watching someone argue fluently in a language the other person did not speak. All the words were correct. The grammar was perfect. The other person simply existed in a different linguistic reality and experienced the argument as ambient sound. The room was completely silent. Not the silence of disengagement. The silence of 40 people trying to process something faster than they were able to. 4 minutes is not a long time. In most contexts, it passes without notice. In a room like that one, with what was happening inside it, the witnesses would later describe it as one of the longest sustained periods of collective confusion they had experienced in a public setting. Because the gladiator was not losing in any way the room knew how to categorize. He was not being outmuscled. Not being outpaced in any simple sense. Not being broken down by accumulating damage. He was, by every visible measure, still fully present and fully engaged. And yet something was leaving the room, something that had arrived with him and had stood for 11 years, as the heaviest thing in any ring he entered. The witnesses felt it going. They could not name it in the moment, but they felt it. He stopped. Not from a single blow that ended the exchange cleanly, the kind of ending a crowd can categorize and carry home with them. Not from exhaustion, visible and measurable, the body's honest surrender to its own limits. Not from injury, which at least provides a narrative, a reason, something to point to in the retelling that makes the ending make sense. He stopped from something the witnesses did not have immediate language for. He was standing, fully upright, his breathing elevated but controlled, his body by any observable measure still capable, still present, and then, in the space between one exchange and the next, in that brief interval that exists in every fight, that half-second of reset, where both men return to neutral before the next moment of contact, he simply did not continue, his hands lowered, not dropped, lowered, with the particular deliberateness of a decision rather than a collapse. The room did not react immediately. Crowds require a moment to understand endings that arrive without the conventional signals. There was a pause, collective, involuntary, where 40 people processed what their eyes had just told them against, what their expectations had prepared them to see. Then the silence changed quality, became something heavier. What the witnesses saw on the gladiator's face in that moment was described, across multiple accounts, with the same word: not pain, not anger, not the particular shame that attaches to public defeat in a world built on public reputation. Recognition, the specific expression of a man who has encountered something that has reorganized his understanding of a subject he believed he had mastered. Not humiliation, that comes later, in private, when the mind returns to the moment and processes it against the ego. What the witnesses saw was prior to that, more immediate. The raw instant of recognition before the self has had time to construct a defense against what it has just learned. He had spent 11 years understanding what combat was, what it required, what it rewarded. He had built an entire architecture of knowledge and applied it with consistency and success across a decade of public demonstration. And in 4 minutes, something had suggested, quietly and without aggression, that the architecture was built on incomplete ground. Not wrong, incomplete, That distinction mattered enormously to a man of his experience. A man told he is wrong can argue, can find counter evidence, can retreat into the considerable fortress of 11 years of proof. But a man shown that his understanding is incomplete has nowhere to go. The evidence is inside the experience now. It has already happened. It cannot be reasoned away because it does not live in the realm of reason. It lives in the body, in the specific, indelible memory of what it felt like to do everything correctly and find it insufficient. Lee said very little when it was over. This was noted. In the circuit, endings carried their own ritual. The exchange of words, the public acknowledgement, the formal restoration of the social order that a challenge temporarily suspends. Lee moved through this briefly, without theatre, without the particular magnanimity that winners sometimes perform for an audience. He was not performing. Several witnesses said afterward that what struck them most about Lee in the moments following the end was that he appeared, genuinely, to have moved on from it already. Not in a dismissive sense. In the sense of a man who had come to do a specific thing, had done it, and was now present in the next moment rather than lingering in the previous one. The gladiator remained in the room longer. He sat at its edge, apart from his people, for a period that several witnesses estimated at close to 20 minutes. Not visibly distressed, not in conversation, simply sitting with whatever had just happened, in the way that serious men sit with serious things. One account, from a source who was present, and whose reliability others in the circuit subsequently vouched for, describes a conversation that took place later that night. Private, between the gladiator and a single trusted associate. The associate asked what had happened. The gladiator was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that the associate remembered precisely enough to repeat, years later, to the person who eventually recorded it. He said that he had spent the entire 4 minutes trying to find the fight, and that he did not believe, looking back, that there had ever been one to find. He did not mean that Lee had been passive. He was precise in clarifying this, unprompted, as though the distinction mattered to him, which it clearly did. He meant something more specific, that the resistance he had encountered did not feel like opposition. It felt like water, like a substance that received force without providing the friction that force requires to function. Every time he had moved toward the fight had ceased to be in that location. He had been, for 4 minutes, arguing with an absence, and the absence had won. The gladiator returned to training 3 weeks after the fight, not immediately, and the people around him noted the gap without commenting on it directly. 3 weeks was not a long time in any conventional sense. It was, however, longer than he had ever taken between engagements in 11 years of continuous activity. The people who knew him well enough to count understood what the interval represented without requiring it to be explained. He came back changed in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss. He was not diminished. That is the first thing his students from that period consistently emphasized when asked about it in later years. He did not return as a smaller version of the man who had left. His technical knowledge was intact, his physical capability unaltered, his commitment to the work, if anything, more serious than it had been before. What had changed was the direction of his attention. Before, his attention had moved outward, toward opponents, toward the circuit, toward the maintenance and extension of a record that had become, over 11 years, a kind of identity. The record was not vanity. It was, in the world he operated in, a form of professional reality. It told the world what he was, and so attending to it had felt, for a long time, like attending to something essential. After, his attention moved inward, toward the gaps. He began studying in a way he had not studied since he was young, not new disciplines, necessarily, though there was some of that. More precisely, he began returning to what he believed he already knew and examining it from underneath, looking at the foundations of his understanding the way an engineer looks at a structure after a stress event. Not assuming damage, not assuming integrity, simply looking, with the specific honesty that becomes available only after certainty has been disturbed. His students noticed the change in how he taught. He began asking questions he had not asked before. Not rhetorical questions, the kind that teachers deploy to move students toward predetermined answers. Genuine questions, the kind that had no prepared answer waiting behind them. Questions about what a technique actually does versus what it is supposed to do, about the difference between a method that works against resistance and a method that works against absence, about what happens when an opponent refuses to provide the friction your system requires. These were not comfortable questions for students trained in the confidence of established method. They were, however, accurate ones, and accuracy, in the long run, is more useful than comfort. The story of that night traveled, not immediately and not loudly. That was never how the circuit moved information. It traveled the way the circuit had always moved everything of significance. Through witnesses to other witnesses, through fighters who had been in the room, to fighters who trusted the accounts of fighters who had been in the room. Across cities, across disciplines, across the considerable distance between people who had dedicated their lives to the same questions and arrived, through different routes, at the same border. What made the story travel was not the outcome. Outcomes traveled all the time. The circuit was built on outcomes. A man wins, a man loses, the record adjusts, the reputation shifts. That was ordinary. That was the mechanism. What made this particular story move differently was what the gladiator had said afterward. The account of that private conversation, the 4 minutes, the search for the fight, the absence that had won, passed from person to person with the particular care that serious practitioners give to information they recognize as rare, not because it was dramatic, because it was precise, because it described something that many of them had wondered about, and none of them had previously heard described with that quality of accuracy. It named something that had been present in their own experiences of the highest levels of the art, unnamed, for years. Lee was gone before most of the people who carried that story had the chance to ask him their questions directly. That fact settled over the legacy of the incident with a particular weight. The man who had provided the demonstration was no longer available to explain it. What remained was the demonstration itself, carried in the bodies and memories of the people who had been present, and in the accounts they passed to the people who had not. In the absence of explanation, the event became something that each practitioner had to interpret through their own experience, through their own hours of training, their own moments of contact, their own accumulated understanding of what the art actually was beneath everything that had been built on top of it. Some understood one thing, some understood another. A few who had trained long enough and honestly enough to have encountered similar questions in their own work understood something close to what had actually happened in that room. They did not speak about it often. Understanding of that depth rarely produces the desire to speak. It produces the desire to return to the work, to go back into the training with the new information and let it do what new information does when it is genuine, reorganize everything quietly from the inside without announcement. The photograph, the one researchers have debated, shows a man at the edge of a ring with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He is not large. His expression gives nothing away. What the photograph cannot show is what the witnesses carried out of that room. What the gladiator carried back to his students, what passed from fighter to fighter across decades and cities and disciplines, until it arrived, still intact, still precise, in the accounts that eventually made this story possible to tell. Some things do not diminish with distance. Some demonstrations, made once, quietly, in a low ceilinged room in front of 40 people who were simply trying to understand what they were seeing, continue long after the room is gone, to teach,